The air in the room was a sterile fiction, a carefully composed lie of purified oxygen and antiseptic that promised neutrality. It smelled of nothing, which was in itself a scent, the scent of control. Elian knew it well. He knew the precise temperature, calibrated to prevent perspiration before the fever took hold. He knew the seamless, pearlescent white of the walls, designed to be without shadow or distraction. He knew the single sheet on the low platform bed, a fabric of synthetic silk analog that was cool to the touch and incapable of holding a wrinkle or a memory. He had known this room, or rooms exactly like it, 6 times before. This was the 7th, a number that felt biblical, and therefore deeply ironic. The agreement had been for one heat, no feelings, a biological transaction, clean and efficient, a release valve for a pressure the directorate acknowledged but preferred to manage in quiet, sanitized spaces like this one. Kale had called it a pragmatic solution. Elian had called it a necessary rebellion. Both were lies they had agreed to believe. Now, on the 7th iteration of their single, pragmatic arrangement, the lie was wearing thin, its edges frayed like a nerve. A tremor started in the base of his spine, a low, familiar hum that was the prelude to the inferno. His body, that disobedient vessel, was beginning its betrayal of the room's sterile promise. Soon his scent would bloom, an unruly garden of ozone and rain-soaked stone, polluting the carefully controlled atmosphere. It was the only part of him the directorate had never fully managed to domesticate, the one wild thing that clawed its way out of the neat columns of his genetic profile. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees in a posture of placid compliance he had perfected over 2 decades in the wards. He was a portrait of calm, a masterpiece of conditioning. Inside, the hum was becoming a vibration, a resonant frequency that threatened to shake the portrait from its frame. He focused on his breath, a technique they had taught him. Inhale control, exhale chaos. But the chaos was already in his blood, a rising tide of heat and need that laughed at the notion of control. It was a joke. The whole system was a joke. A society built on the violent suppression of biology only to create sterile rooms where that same biology could be indulged under strict protocol. The door slid open with a whisper of compressed air, and Kyle entered. He moved with an economy of motion that was both elegant and unnerving, the way a predator moves through a familiar territory. He was an enforcer, and he wore the role as a second skin, the severe lines of his dark grey uniform mapping the disciplined austerity of his soul. His scent preceded him, a clean, sharp fragrance of cold steel and pine resin, a stark counterpoint to the room's manufactured nothingness and the burgeoning storm within Elian. It cut through the haze in Elian's mind, a focal point in the sensory chaos. Kale did not speak immediately. He performed his own ritual first. A small panel on the wall slid open, and he placed his sidearm and his comm unit inside, the metallic clicks echoing in the silent room. Lock away the tools of the enforcer. Become the tool of the body. It was part of their theater, the pretense that here, in this room, they were equals. They were not. He was the system, and Elian was its product. Kyle turned, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally settling on Elian. His expression was unreadable, a mask of professional calm. It was the same expression he had worn the first time, and the second, and all the times in between. The consistency should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like a silent accusation. "Are you prepared?" Elian? His voice was a low baritone, as measured and controlled as the rest of him. It was a question of logistics, of readiness. It was not a question of want or fear, or the terrifying hope that was beginning to curdle in Elian's gut. It was the first line of the script they had written for themselves. Elian inclined his head, the movement small, precise, the perfect compliant Omega. I am. The words were ash in his mouth, prepared. He had been preparing his entire life, conditioned for a function he despised. And yet, this specific preparation for this man in this room felt different. It had felt different from the very beginning. The lie was not that there were no feelings. The lie was that there had ever been a moment, since Kale first walked into this room, when feelings were not the entire point. The heat was just the excuse, the biological cover for a crime of emotion they were both committing, over and over again. The tremor in his spine intensified, a deep, resonant thrum. The fever was rising. The seventh heat was beginning. And this time, Elian knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the lie would not be enough to contain them. Kale watched the subtle shift in Elian's posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles along his neck. He catalogued the signs with the detached precision of a field analyst assessing a volatile situation. Pupils dilating, a faint sheen of moisture on the brow, the shallow, quickened pace of his breathing. The pheromonal signature in the air was shifting, the clean antiseptic note being steadily overwritten by the rich petrichor scent of Elian's distress. It was a scent Kale knew intimately now, a complex fragrance he could deconstruct into its component parts: fear, defiance, and a deep, aching loneliness that resonated with a frequency he refused to acknowledge within himself. His own systems were responding, a low thrum of possessiveness stirring in his gut, an instinct he had been trained since adolescence to master, to cage, to control. Control was the bedrock of his existence. It was the core principle of the Directorate, the philosophy that had dragged their society back from the brink of biological anarchy. Control was safety. Control was sanity. This room, this arrangement, was an exercise in control, a controlled burn to prevent a wildfire. He repeated the words to himself, a mantra that had served him for 6 previous cycles. It was beginning to sound hollow. He had selected Elian from a series of profiles presented to him by the Bureau of Progenitive Affairs. It was a privilege of his rank, the ability to arrange a private cycle rather than submit to the impersonal clinical pairings offered to the general populace. The profiles had been sanitized, filled with genetic markers, compatibility indices, and psychological stability metrics. Elian's file had been exemplary, high pheromonal compatibility, a psychological evaluation that highlighted his resilience and emotional containment. The summary described him as a low-risk asset, a model product of the ward system, a perfect choice for an arrangement that demanded absolute emotional detachment. But it was the photograph attached to the file that had made the final decision. A stark, monochrome image. Elian, younger then, looked not at the camera, but slightly past it, his expression not blank, but empty. It was the emptiness of a vessel that had been deliberately hollowed out, and in that void, Kale had recognized a faint echo of his own. That was the truth he never logged in any official report. He had chosen Elian not for the data, but for the resonance of his damage. He moved toward the bed, his boots silent on the sterile floor. The protocol was clear. He was to initiate physical contact to establish a calming baseline before the heat's apex, a hand on the shoulder, a steadying pressure. It was all outlined in the manuals. But when he stood before Elian, looking down at the elegant line of his bent neck, the manuals and protocols felt like a foreign language describing a world that had nothing to do with the reality of this room. Elian did not look up. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved from tension. Kyle saw the pulse beating in his throat, a frantic, trapped thing. He reached out, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second too long in the space between them. The hesitation was a breach of his own internal discipline, a crack in the armor. He finally let his hand rest on Elian's shoulder. The fabric of the simple tunic was cool, but beneath it, the heat radiating from Elian's skin was a palpable force. It was not the dry, clinical heat of a fever, but something vital, alive. A shock went through him, a jolt of connection that was far more than mere biology. He felt the tremor in Elian's body travel up his arm, a direct transmission of the chaos he was trying to contain. Elian flinched, a minute, instantly suppressed reaction. But Kyle felt it. He had felt it every time. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a man on the verge of breaking. And Kyle, the embodiment of control, was the one holding the hammer. The thought was treason. He tightened his grip, the gesture meant to be reassuring, dominant. Instead, it felt desperate. The controlled burn was already raging, and he was standing in the heart of the flame. The touch was a brand, a point of ignition. Elian's carefully constructed composure shattered into 1,000 pieces, the practiced stillness dissolving into a full-body tremor. The heat, which had been a low hum, roared into a furnace, a wave of fire that consumed thought, memory, and the last vestiges of his conditioning. The room, with its white walls and sterile air, dissolved into a blur of pure sensation. There was only the heat and the weight of Kale's hand on his shoulder, and the sharp, clean scent of pine and steel that was his only anchor in the storm. This was the part he both craved and feared, the dissolution of self. In the wards, they had called it the hysteria, a biological failing to be medicated, suppressed, and studied with cold, detached curiosity. Doctors with clipboards had watched him through reinforced glass, their faces impassive as he writhed, his body a stranger to him. They had documented his pain, his delirium, but had never once offered a hand to hold. Kyle's hand was not gentle. It was firm, possessive, the hand of an enforcer claiming territory. But it was present. It was real. It was the antithesis of the ward's sterile observation. It was a human touch in the heart of the fire, and that, he was beginning to understand, was a danger far greater than any fever. His mind fractured, slipping between the present and the past. He was here, in this room, Kale's thumb stroking a slow, deliberate circle against his collarbone. And he was there, a boy of 10, huddled on a cold floor, watching another boy being led away by a figure in a grey uniform, the child's cries echoing down the long, white corridor until they were swallowed by the silence. The uniform was the same. The silence was the same. The feeling of absolute powerlessness was the same. But here, the powerlessness was laced with a strange, intoxicating poison. A surrender that felt less like defeat and more like release. Kyle's other hand came to rest on his waist, pulling him back against a body that was as unyielding as the system it served. Elian's head fell back against Kyle's shoulder, a gesture of submission his conscious mind would have fought. The scent of the alpha was overwhelming now, a complex and heady perfume that spoke of dominance, and a tightly leashed violence. It should have terrified him. It did. But it also called to a part of him he had been taught to deny, a primal instinct that recognized its match, its counterpart. He was losing the thread of their arrangement, the clean lines of the contract blurring in the heat haze. One heat, a single, sterile transaction. No feelings. He could feel Kale's breath against his ear, steady and controlled, a stark contrast to his own ragged gasps. He was a case study, a biological imperative to be managed. That was what he was supposed to be to this man. But the hand at his waist was not the hand of a scientist. The low sound that rumbled in Kale's chest was not the sound of a clinician. It was the growl of a predator, and it vibrated through Elian's bones, waking things that had slept for a very long time. In a moment of fleeting clarity, a bubble of coherence in the boiling sea of instinct, he turned his head, his lips brushing the rough fabric of Kyle's uniform. The words escaped him before he could stop them, a raw whisper against the cold steel of the insignia on Kyle's collar. Why me? The question was a violation. It was intimate. It was emotional. It was everything their agreement was designed to prevent. It hung in the superheated air between them, a fragile, trembling thing. He felt Kyle stiffen, the steady rhythm of his breathing faltering for a single, critical beat. The anchor was slipping. The storm was claiming them both. The question struck Kale with the force of a physical blow. 3 words, whispered with the raw vulnerability of a soul stripped bare by fever, and they dismantled his entire defense system. It was a catastrophic failure of protocol. Elian was not supposed to ask questions. He was not supposed to introduce the variable of why into their equation. Their interactions were meant to be a script of actions and reactions, purely physical, devoid of curiosity or emotional inquiry. This was a deviation, a contamination. Kyle's training screamed at him to ignore it, to redirect, to re-establish the parameters of the engagement. He should have pushed Elian away, put space between them, and reiterated the terms of their contract with cold, hard precision. His body, however, refused to obey. It remained locked in place, his hands still holding Elian, his senses still drinking in the intoxicating scent of the Omega's surrender. The single beat of his faltered breath stretched into an eternity of silence. He had no answer, not an honest one. The official answer was locked away in his memory, a string of data points from a file. Subject 734, Elian. Optimal pheromonal match, high threshold for psychological stress, conditioned for compliance, low emotional risk. He could recite the data. He could deliver the cold, clinical justification for his choice. It would be a lie, a necessary professional lie, but a lie nonetheless. The truth was a shapeless, dangerous thing that lived in the space between the data points. The truth was in the haunted emptiness of a photograph, in the quiet defiance he saw in Elian's eyes, even as he feigned compliance. The truth was that he had not chosen a low-risk asset. He had chosen the one subject whose damage seemed to mirror his own, a fellow prisoner in a different kind of cage. To admit that would be to admit a weakness, an emotional vulnerability that an enforcer, a pillar of the Directorate's ideology of control, could not afford. He was a container of threats. His entire life was dedicated to identifying, isolating, and neutralizing chaos. But Elian was not a threat to the state. He was a threat to Kale's own rigorously constructed state of being. He did not answer the question. Instead, he reacted, driven by an instinct far older and more powerful than any directorate protocol. He tightened his hold, turning Elian to face him, his movements swift and decisive. He lowered his head, his mouth claiming Elian's in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was a desperate, angry act of suppression. He was trying to silence the question, to smother it with sensation, to drive the intimacy of it out of the room with the sheer force of his own biology. He poured all his frustration, all his control, all the terror of his own compromised emotions into that single, brutal act. But it was a miscalculation. Instead of pushing Elian away, of re-establishing the hierarchy, the kiss became a conduit. He could taste the fever, the fear, the desperate loneliness on Elian's lips. And Elian, instead of recoiling, yielded completely, his body melting against Kale's, his hands coming up to clutch at the front of Kale's uniform. It was not compliance. It was a drowning man clinging to a rock in a stormy sea. The heat in the room escalated, a feedback loop of scent and touch and raw, unspoken need. The apex was upon them, a wave of pure instinct that threatened to sweep away everything. In that moment, as his own control shattered like glass, as the carefully built walls of a lifetime of discipline crumbled into dust, a single word escaped his lips, breathed against Elian's skin, a sound of pure, unguarded possession. Elian. It was not the designation of a subject. It was the utterance of a name, a prayer, a confession, a breach from which there was no return. The fever receded like a tide going out, leaving behind a landscape of tangled limbs and raw nerves. The silence that descended was different from the sterile silence that had preceded the storm. This silence was heavy, thick with the scent of aftermath, with the ghost of a name spoken in the dark. Elian lay on the synthetic sheets, his body aching with a strange combination of satisfaction and sorrow. He watched Kale through heavy-lidded eyes as the Alpha detached himself, moving with a stiff, deliberate grace that signaled a rapid reconstruction of his defenses. The Enforcer was reassembling himself, piece by piece. Kale stood and began to dress, his movements precise, economical, a ballet of restored control. The dark grey uniform, a symbol of unyielding order, covered the skin that had been, moments before, a canvas of pure instinct. Each button fastened, each seam straightened, was another brick being laid in the wall between them. The intimacy of the heat was being systematically erased, packed away like a dangerous piece of evidence. Elian felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was a ghost in this sterile room, a witness to a scene that had already ended. Kale's name for him, whispered in the peak of the fever, echoed in his mind. It had been spoken with an intimacy that had stripped away the clinical nature of their arrangement, laying bare the raw, beating heart of whatever this had become. Now, watching Kyle's retreat into his professional shell, it felt as though the word had never been spoken at all. Perhaps he had imagined it, a hallucination born of the heat, but he knew he hadn't. He had felt the vibration of it against his skin, a brand more permanent than any touch. Kyle finished dressing, his back still to Elian. He did not look in the mirror that covered one wall, a flawless, silvered surface that reflected the room's cold perfection. He did not need to. His composure was an internal state, not a reflection. A memory surfaced in Elian's mind, unbidden and sharp with a child's clarity. He was 8 years old, in the infirmary of Ward Gamma. A boy in the next bed, A fragile, quiet child named Reese had developed an unsanctioned empathic talent. He could feel the emotions of others, a chaotic and uncontrollable influx that left him screaming in the night. Elian remembered the enforcers coming, not Kale, but men like him, clad in the same grey, moving with the same dispassionate efficiency. They had stood over Reese's bed, their faces unreadable. One of them had placed a hand on the boy's forehead, and a strange, cold calm had descended. Reese had stopped screaming. He had simply gone quiet, his eyes wide and empty. They had taken him away, and no one ever spoke his name again. Elian watched Kale's reflection in the polished floor, the same uniform, the same aura of cold, absolute control. The system that had erased Reese was the same system that had created Elian, and it was the same system that Kyle served with unwavering devotion. His rebellion, this series of clandestine heats, had felt like a personal act of defiance, a way to reclaim his own body from the state, but now he saw it for what it truly was. It was never about his body. It was about confronting the architect of his cage, and he had invited the architect into the cage with him 7 times. The irony was a bitter pill. Kale finally turned, his face once again a perfect mask of neutrality. "The cycle is complete," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The transport will arrive for you in 30 minutes. It was the closing line of their script, but the script was ruined, the pages torn. A name had been spoken, a rule had been broken, and the play could never be performed the same way again." Kale walked through the pristine, silent corridors of the Directorate Central Command, the rhythmic click of his boots on the polished obsidian floor, a metronome marking his return to order. The air here was recycled, filtered to a degree of purity that left it smelling of nothing but faint, cool electricity. It was a relief after the heady, organic chaos of the containment suite. He sought the sterile embrace of his work, the clean, logical flow of data and directives. He needed to purge the scent of ozone and rain from his senses, to erase the memory of a whispered name, to recalibrate his own internal systems back to their default setting of dispassionate control. He sat at his terminal, the cool blue light of the holographic interface washing over his face, casting him in the same impersonal glow as the data streams he monitored. He was an enforcer. His purpose was to maintain the stability of the system. His personal biology was a liability, a variable to be managed, not a force to surrender to. The arrangement with Elian was supposed to be a tool for that management. It had become a complication, a critical error in his judgment. He typed a command, his fingers moving with swift, practiced efficiency. Access file, subject 734, Elian, Ward Gamma, cross-reference, security review, active. The system chimed, requesting level 4 authorization. He pressed his thumb to the bioscanner. Access granted. Elian's file materialized in the air before him, a cascade of cool blue text and monochrome images. He scrolled past the familiar metrics, the genetic sequences, the pheromonal charts, the psychological stability graphs. He had memorized this data. It was the foundation of the lie he had told himself. He was looking for something else now, an explanation, a reason for the anomaly he was experiencing, a reason why this particular Omega, this low-risk asset, was systematically dismantling his defenses. He bypassed the primary medical and psychological reports, delving into the archived subfiles, the raw data from Elian's formative years in the ward system. Much of it was mundane: dietary logs, educational assessments, sleep cycle monitoring. But then he found it. A series of encrypted incident reports from when Elian was a child. The encryption was old, a legacy code from the Directorate's early, more experimental days. It took him several minutes to bypass it. The files that opened were not like the neat, summarized reports in the main file. These were raw notes, observations from researchers. They spoke of non-standard empathic resonance, of a child who seemed to react to the emotional states of others without any external cues. One report detailed an incident where Elian had exhibited symptoms of panic and distress that perfectly mirrored those of another child in a separate, isolated chamber. There was no physical or sensory link. The researchers had called it a bioresonant anomaly and had recommended the subject for the aura suppression protocol. Another file contained the protocol itself, a regimen of psychochemical conditioning designed to dampen and eventually cauterize any latent empathic or telepathic abilities. It was classified as a containment procedure for potentially disruptive genetic traits. The final entry was a single, stark sentence. Protocol successful. Subject's resonant abilities have been suppressed to baseline dormant levels, reclassified as emotionally stable and low risk. It was a lie, a deliberate, calculated fabrication. The Directorate hadn't seen Elian as a model Omega. They had seen him as a potential threat, a weapon, and had performed a kind of psychic surgery on him, leaving him scarred and unaware of what he had lost. They had hollowed him out and called him stable. A cold, sharp anger, unfamiliar and unwelcome, coiled in Kyle's gut. This was not the anger of an enforcer discovering a breach of protocol. This was the anger of a man discovering that the foundation of his carefully constructed world was built on a bedrock of cruelty and deception, and he, by choosing Elian, by participating in this sterile arrangement, had become an unwitting accomplice to that cruelty. He looked at the monochrome photo of the boy with the empty eyes, and for the first time he understood that the emptiness was not a void. It was a crater, the site of an explosion no one was ever meant to know about. And he felt a sudden, terrifying instinct rise within him, an instinct that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with protection. The transport deposited him back at his assigned residence, a small, efficient unit in one of the city's towering residential spires. The silence here was different from the silence of the containment suite. It was a thin, lonely silence, punctuated by the faint hum of the building's life support systems. Elian moved through the sparely furnished rooms, his body feeling both heavy and strangely light, as if it no longer quite belonged to him. The post-heat protocol was ingrained in him, a sequence of actions he could perform without thought. Hydrate, consume the nutrient paste, initiate the suppressant cycle. It was the final step in the process of erasure, the chemical command that would scrub his body clean of the fever's aftermath, reset his hormones, and return him to the state of placid neutrality the Directorate required. He stood before the medical dispenser unit integrated into the wall of his small sanitation chamber. Its smooth white surface was cold and impersonal. A single green light pulsed softly, indicating it was ready. He was scheduled for a double dose, the standard procedure to ensure rapid restabilization. He placed his palm on the scanner. The unit whirred softly and recognized him. Subject 734. Elian, post-cycle suppressant protocol initiated. Please remain still. He stared at the pulsing green light, and the memory of Kyle's voice saying his name washed over him again. Elian, not a number, not a subject, a name, spoken with an intimacy that contradicted everything Kale's uniform, his posture, his very existence represented. It was a crack in the perfect, cold facade of the system, a single anomalous data point that threw the entire equation into chaos. For 7 cycles he had followed the protocol without question. He had allowed this man, this enforcer, to use his body, and in return he had been granted a brief, savage taste of something real, something his life in the wards had denied him. And then he had dutifully returned to his cage and taken the medicine that made him forget the feeling of the sun on his skin. He had accepted the numbness as the price of that fleeting, controlled rebellion. But what if the rebellion wasn't the heat? What if the real rebellion was what came after? The choice to feel the echoes, to live with the consequences, to refuse the chemical reset that made it all neat and tidy and meaningless. He thought of the look in Kale's eyes in that final moment of the heat's apex. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the enforcer had slipped, and he had seen something else, something raw and unguarded, something that looked terrifyingly like feeling. The directorate had built him to be a machine of compliance. They had suppressed his instincts, medicated his emotions, and conditioned his responses. They had told him that feeling was a sickness, that his biology was a flaw to be managed. Kyle was the embodiment of that philosophy. But Kyle had spoken his name. He had broken the rule. The green light on the dispenser blinked faster, signaling its readiness to administer the dose. The low hum intensified. A small tray would slide out with the hypo spray, and he would press it to his neck, and the world would go back to its familiar shade of grey. He would become numb again. He would forget the weight of Kyle's hand, the scent of pine and steel, the sound of his own name on the lips of the enemy. He did not want to forget. He was tired of being numb. With a steady hand, he reached out and pressed the emergency override panel next to the dispenser. A red light flashed. A soft, insistent alarm began to chime. Protocol interrupted. Manual override engaged. Please report to your assigned proctor. He ignored it. He took his hand away from the scanner and stepped back from the wall. The alarm continued its polite, insistent plea. It was the sound of a rule being broken. It was the sound of a choice being made. In the sterile silence of his apartment, surrounded by the machinery of his own containment, Elian smiled. It was a small, fragile, and utterly defiant thing. Weeks bled into one another, a seamless procession of grey days marked only by the shifting light outside his window. Kale found himself mired in a state of perpetual, low-grade agitation. He performed his duties with his usual flawless efficiency. His reports were as concise and precise as ever, but beneath the surface of his professional calm, a dissonant frequency hummed. It was the echo of Elian, a psychic reverberation he could not shake. It was not the memory of the heat itself. He was disciplined enough to compartmentalize the physical. It was the lingering resonance of the emotional breach, the question, the name, the discovery in the archives. These things had become a virus in his system, corrupting the clean code of his conditioning. He found himself rereading the redacted files on Elian's suppressed empathy, cross-referencing them with other classified documents on bioresonant phenomena. He was behaving erratically, pursuing a line of inquiry that had no bearing on his official duties. It was a risk. A colleague, noting his unusual activity in the archives, had made a casual remark. Revisiting old ghosts, Kale. He had deflected the question with a cold stare, but the observation had unnerved him. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that Elian had not taken his suppressants. The Directorate's monitoring system was designed to be absolute, but there were ways, subtle, desperate ways, to cheat it. An Omega with enough willpower could disrupt the absorption of the chemicals, could metabolize them inefficiently, could hold onto the echoes of the cycle long after they were supposed to have faded. Kale could feel it, a faint, distant pull, like a stray magnetic field interfering with his own internal compass. It was a whisper of Elian's unfiltered emotional state, a consequence of the non-standard empathic resonance the Directorate had tried and failed to completely erase. It was a connection he should not have been able to perceive, and it was a direct violation of Directorate law. Elian's defiance was not just a personal choice, it was a systemic threat, and he, as an enforcer, had a sworn duty to contain such threats. He stood for a long time in his own apartment, the city's glittering lights spread out like a web below him. Duty. The word was the cornerstone of his identity. He had sacrificed everything for it. Personal connections, emotional freedom, the possibility of a life outside the rigid confines of the Directorate. He had believed in the necessity of that sacrifice. He had believed in the order it preserved. Now that belief felt like a cage he had built for himself. His duty demanded he report Elian. It demanded he personally escort the Omega to a recalibration facility, where they would scrub his mind and body with chemicals and psych dampeners until the last spark of defiance was extinguished. They would fix the flaw. They would make him compliant again. The thought was intolerable. He made his decision. He would go to Elian's apartment. He would go not as the partner from their clandestine arrangement, but as Kale, the enforcer. He would confront Elian. He would enforce the protocol. He would restore order. He told himself this all the way there, the words a desperate litany against the rising tide of his own treason. The transport docked silently at Elian's residential spire. He walked down the identical corridors, his footsteps the only sound. When he stood before the door to Elian's unit, he did not use the access code from their arrangement. He used his enforcer override. The door slid open with a sharp, authoritative hiss. Elian was standing by the window, looking out at the rain-streaked sky. He did not seem surprised to see him. He simply turned, his expression calm, his eyes clear and impossibly deep. The air in the room was thick with Elian's scent, undiluted by suppressants, a rich and complex fragrance that was both a confession and a challenge. Kale stood in the doorway, the grey uniform feeling like a costume. "You missed your dosage," he said. The words came out flat, cold, an accusation, a statement of fact, the opening move in a confrontation he already knew he was destined to lose. Elian watched Kale in the doorway, a figure of grey and steel framed against the sterile white of the corridor. He was the system made manifest, the cold logic of the Directorate given human form. And yet, for the first time, Elian did not feel the familiar chill of fear. The absence of the suppressants had left him raw, his senses sharp, his emotions close to the surface. But it had also unlocked something else, a faint, dormant perception he now recognized as the echo of the empathy they had tried to carve out of him. He could feel Kale, not his thoughts, but the shape of his emotions. He could feel the rigid discipline warring with a turbulent undercurrent of conflict, of a strange, fierce protectiveness that was directed, impossibly, at him. It was like hearing a dissonant chord in a perfectly structured piece of music. a flaw that made the whole thing terrifyingly real. He did not deny the accusation. He had known this moment was coming. "I am tired of being numb," he said, his voice quiet but steady. It was not an excuse. It was a declaration, a truth he had not allowed himself to acknowledge for years, now laid bare between them. Kyle took a step into the room, the door sliding shut behind him, sealing them in. The space felt suddenly small, charged with a tension that was different from the feral energy of the heat. This was a tension of wills, of ideologies. The power dynamic was stark, undeniable. Kale was the enforcer, the agent of the state, his sidearm a visible weight on his hip. Elian was the ward, the subject, the disobedient component in the machine. By law, Kale should have had him restrained and sedated by now. But he just stood there, his winter sky eyes fixed on Ilian, his posture a study in controlled violence. Tired, Kyle's voice was laced with a cold incredulity. "Numbness is stability, Ilian. It is the foundation of our peace. You know the consequences of this. Recalibration is not a pleasant process." He was reciting the doctrine, the cold catechism of their society. But Elian could feel the lack of conviction behind the words. He could feel the man warring with the enforcer. "The peace of a graveyard is still peace, isn't it?" Elian took a step forward, closing the distance between them. It was a reckless move, a challenge. "They did something to me in the wards, something more than just conditioning." He was guessing, speaking a truth he felt in his bones, rather than one he knew with his mind. He watched Kyle's face, searching for a reaction. He saw it, a flicker in the eyes, a minute tightening of the jaw. He had hit a nerve. "You know what it was? I think that's why you're here. Not to enforce a law, but to understand a variable you can't control." He was using the language of the system against its master. He pushed further, trusting the strange, invisible current that flowed between them. "I remember things. A boy named Reese. They took him away because he could feel too much. Is that what they did to me? Did they try to take it away?" He saw the confirmation in Kyle's stillness, in the sudden, stark bleakness that clouded his features. He had him. The enforcer was compromised. The man was exposed. Kyle felt the foundations of his world cracking. Ilian's words, his intuitive leaps, were impossibly accurate. The dormant empathy was awakening, and through it, Ilian was seeing past the uniform, past the conditioning, and into the compromised core of Kyle himself. The protocol was clear: neutralize the threat, but the man standing before him was not a threat. He was the living, breathing evidence of the system's fundamental corruption. "They classified it as a bio-resonant anomaly," Kale said, the words tasting like poison. The admission was an act of treason. He was sharing classified information with a deviant subject. They believed it was a contagion, a threat to emotional stability. They developed a protocol to suppress it. "To erase it," Ilian corrected, his voice soft but sharp as glass. "To hollow out a child and call him stable." The words were a perfect echo of Kyle's own thoughts from the archive room. The resonance between them was no longer a subtle pull. It was a clear, ringing chime. They were two broken pieces of the same machine, two prisoners who had just been shown the blueprints of their own cages. The choice was suddenly, starkly clear. He could follow his orders. He could drag Elian back to the machine, to be broken again. Or he could break the machine itself. His hand went to his side, his fingers brushing against the cold, hard polymer of his sidearm. It was the symbol of his power, his authority, his duty. He could use it to enforce the law, or he could use it to break it. He looked at Elian, who stood before him, unafraid, waiting for the verdict. For the first time in his adult life, Kale did not know what to do. The enforcer had no orders for this. The silence in the room stretched, thin and taut, on the verge of snapping. Every hum of the building's systems, every distant sigh of the city outside, seemed to amplify the profound stillness between the two men. Kale's hand remained frozen, hovering over the instrument of his authority, a bridge between two irreconcilable worlds. He was a fulcrum, and the weight of his entire existence, of Elian's future, rested on the pivot point of his choice. The enforcer in him screamed of protocol, of duty, of the chaos that would follow a single act of defiance. The man, a part of him he had long considered dormant, vestigial, spoke of the crater in Elian's eyes, of the lie of stability, of the intolerable cruelty of a system that hollowed out a soul and called it peace. He saw the timeline split before him. In one, he followed his orders. He would apprehend Elian, his face a mask of professional regret. Elian would be taken to a white room, much like the one where they met, but this one would offer no release, only erasure, and Kale would return to his duties, his belief in the system shattered, a ghost haunting the machine he served. He would be a perfect enforcer, outwardly flawless, inwardly dead. In the other timeline, the future was a blank, terrifying void. To defy the Directorate was not just to break a rule, it was to declare war on the very fabric of his reality. There was no quiet retirement for treasonous enforcers. There was only termination, and Elian, unregistered, unsuppressed, would be a fugitive, hunted by men exactly like the man Kale had been his entire life. It was not a choice between order and chaos. It was a choice between two different kinds of oblivion. He finally let his hand fall away from his sidearm. He turned, his movements stiff, and walked to the wall panel that housed the apartment's surveillance and monitoring unit. It was a standard Directorate installation, its systems woven into the very structure of the building. With a series of swift, precise commands, he accessed the master controls. His authorization codes sliced through the firewalls with ease. The screen glowed with the unit's status. Audio surveillance, active. Pheromonal monitoring, active. Biometric tracking, active. He paused for a fraction of a second, then systematically he deactivated each one. Audio surveillance, terminated. Pheromonal monitoring, terminated. Biometric tracking, terminated. A final line of text blinked in stark red letters. Warning, unit offline. System integrity compromised. Mandatory report filed. It was done. The act was irrevocable. He was no longer an enforcer. He was a traitor. He turned back to face Elian. The absence of the surveillance systems created a new kind of silence, a privacy so absolute it felt like a physical presence. It was the first time in Elian's entire life that he had been truly alone, unobserved by the state. The first time Kale had been truly off the record. The old rules, the old roles had been vaporized. They were just two men standing in a small, quiet room, the wreckage of their lives around them. The lie they had told themselves for 7 cycles seemed like a child's fantasy now. One heat, no feelings. The irony was so profound, it was almost comical. All that was left was feeling, a terrifying, exhilarating, and completely uncharted ocean of it. Kale looked at Elian, and for the first time, his face was not a mask. The control was gone, stripped away by his own hand, and what lay beneath was a landscape of exhaustion, fear, and a fierce, uncertain hope. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing directly in front of Elian. He slowly, hesitantly, raised his hand. It was not the firm, possessive hand of the alpha in the heat, nor the dispassionate hand of the enforcer. It was just a hand, trembling slightly. He did not touch Elian's face or his shoulder. Instead, he reached for Elian's hand, his fingers gently closing around it. The contact was not about passion or dominance or control. It was about solidarity, a new contract being written in a language of touch, with no clauses, no protocols, only consequences. Outside, the system they had both served and defied was already beginning to hunt for them. But in the quiet of the small room, for the first time, they were free.